Get her out of this hall." The voice was low, controlled, and utterly without mercy. Sarah did not move at first. She stood at the edge of the great corridor with her mop still dripping onto the marble floor, her gray uniform damp at the sleeves, her hair pulled back so tightly it gave her a permanent look of mild surprise. The soldier who had spoken was staring at her with the particular brand of contempt that upper-ranking wolves reserved for omegas who forgot their place. She had not forgotten her place. She simply had not expected anyone to come down the east wing at this hour. "I said move," he repeated, and this time his hand came toward her shoulder, and Sarah stepped back before he could touch her, because she had learned long ago that contact with soldiers rarely ended well for people like her. She gathered her bucket and her mop, and she walked away without looking back, which was also something she had learned. You did not look back. Looking back implied you thought you had something worth defending, and Sarah had not believed that about herself in a very long time. The Palace of Ashenvale was not a kind place to work. It was a beautiful place, in the way that very dangerous things are often beautiful, all cold stone and high ceilings, and portraits of warriors with silver eyes, the kind of eyes that seemed to follow you down hallways no matter how quietly you tried to move. Sarah had been working here for 8 months, which was longer than most Omegas lasted, in service to the Alpha King. Not because the work was extraordinarily brutal, though it was demanding enough, but because the palace had a way of making you feel your smallness so acutely that many people simply could not survive it emotionally. Sarah survived it because she was, as her former pack had told her on the day they cast her out, extraordinarily good at being nothing. "You have no wolf," Elder Brannock had said, standing before her in the circle of judgment, while her packmates watched. From the edges with expressions that ranged from pity to relief. "You have no scent that registers as one of us. You are a drain on resources and a mark of shame on this bloodline. You are released." Released. As though she had been a held breath, something the pack had been waiting to exhale. She was 19 then. She was 23 now, and she had made a life of sorts out of the edges of things, and she had told herself that was enough. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. She heard the crying before she reached the north stairwell. It was not ordinary crying. It was the kind of sound that bypassed the ears entirely and went straight to something older in the chest, something primal and urgent that could not be reasoned with. Sarah had been assigned to clean the corridor outside the royal nursery that evening, which was considered either a great honor or a great punishment depending on who you asked, because cleaning near the heirs meant absolute silence, absolute invisibility, and absolutely no mistakes. She had been doing it for 6 weeks without incident, which was perhaps why no one had yet thought to reassign her. The crying intensified as she approached, and through the heavy oak door she could hear raised voices, the clipped efficiency of healers giving instructions, the lower murmur of nurses attempting comfort, and beneath all of it, beneath every adult attempt at control and calm, 2 small voices screaming with a desperation that made Sarah's hands go still on the handle of her cleaning cart. King Kaelin Ashenvale had lost his queen 11 months ago. That was the story everyone knew. The story told in careful, neutral tones by palace staff, who had learned that the wrong expression in the wrong corridor could cost you your position. Queen Mirabelle had died bringing the twins into the world, and the king, who had been feared before that day for his coldness and his precision, had become something else afterward. He had become a silence that occupied space the way walls do, and people navigated around that silence very carefully. The twins, Prince Aldrich and Prince Soren, were healthy, according to the healers. They were strong, as royal lichen heirs always were, with good lungs and good appetites, and the particular bright-eyed intensity of children who carry ancient blood. But in the past 3 days, they had screamed. They had screamed with a persistence that was beginning to alarm the entire court, not only because the sound was difficult to endure, but because no one could find a reason for it. The healers had examined them. The nurses had tried every comfort available. The wet nurses had been cycled in and out. Nothing worked. Nothing stopped the sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than hunger or pain or ordinary infant distress. Sarah was not supposed to open that door. She was very clear on this point as she stood outside it. She was an Omega without a wolf, which meant she registered to other werewolves as something close to a human, something beneath consideration in the complex hierarchy of pack society. She had no business touching royal heirs. She had no business being anywhere near them. The appropriate thing to do was to complete her assigned section of corridor and leave, which was what she fully intended to do, right up until the moment the crying changed pitch and became something so raw and so desperate that her body moved before her mind gave permission. She pushed open the door. The nursery was a large, warm room lit by enchanted stones that gave off gentle amber light. There were 4 nurses present, 2 healers in their gray robes, and a head attendant named Marta, whose expression when she saw Sarah enter was the precise picture of outraged disbelief. "What are you doing in here?" Marta began, stepping forward with the authority of someone who had been managing royal spaces for 20 years. But Sarah was not looking at Marta. She was looking at the 2 cradles in the center of the room, and at the 2 small faces inside them, red with effort and wet with tears. And she was walking toward them before she had made any conscious decision to do so. "Stop," Marta said sharply. "You cannot touch the heirs. You are an unranked Omega. You have no clearance. You need to leave immediately before I call the guard." Sarah stopped walking. She stood approximately 2 feet from the cradles, and she looked down at the 2 boys, and something very strange happened. The crying did not stop, but it changed. It shifted from desperate to something almost questioning, as though some part of the infants had registered her presence and was trying to understand it. "Remove her," Marta said to one of the nurses, and the nurse started toward Sarah. And then Sarah did something she had not planned and could not have explained. She reached out her hand, not touching, just extending, just offering the proximity of her palm over the nearest cradle, and the child inside, Prince Aldrich, turned his head toward her hand with the accuracy of something following a scent or a warmth or a frequency no one else in the room could detect. And he stopped crying. It happened that fast, that completely, that impossibly. He simply stopped, and his face went from anguished to calm with a speed that made every adult in the room go absolutely still. His brother, in the cradle beside him, fell, silent 3 seconds later. The silence was so sudden and so total that it felt like a physical thing, like a wall going up in a room that had been opened to a storm. Marta stared. The healers stared. Sarah very carefully did not move, because she understood that whatever was happening was fragile, and also that she was in very serious trouble, and she did not want to make either of those things worse. "What did you do?" Marta said, and her voice had lost its authority. It was just a question now. "Nothing," Sarah said honestly. I came in." One of the healers, an older woman with silver-streaked hair named Healer Voss, stepped forward and looked at Sarah with an expression that Sarah had never seen directed at her before. It was not contempt or dismissal. It was something very close to professional alarm. "Who are you?" Healer Voss asked. "Sarah," she said. "I clean the east and north corridors." "Your full name," Voss said. "Sarah. Just Sarah. I was released from my birth pack." Healer looked at her for a long moment, and then looked at the now sleeping infants, and then looked back at Sarah with that same careful, calculating expression. "Do not leave the palace," Voss said finally. "I need to send word to someone." The someone turned out to be the king. Sarah had never been in the same room as King Kalen before this night. She had seen him at a distance twice, once crossing the Great Hall with his war council, and once standing at a high window with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to make grief look like discipline. He was larger than she had expected, not just in height, which was considerable, but in the way that very powerful wolves occupy space, as though the air around them has more weight. He had silver eyes, like all the portraits in the corridor, but in person they were less decorative and more unsettling, the kind of eyes that processed things very quickly and revealed almost nothing of what they concluded. He stood in the doorway of the nursery and looked at Sarah with those eyes for what felt like a very long time. And Sarah, who had been instructed by Marta and healer Voss to stay exactly where she was, stayed exactly where she was. She calmed them, Voss said from beside the king. Immediately, both of them, without touching them. The king's gaze did not leave Sarah. How? He said. His voice was even quieter in person than it had been in the corridor 8 months ago, when she had heard it tell a soldier to remove her. It was the voice of someone who had no need to raise it to be obeyed. I do not know, Sarah said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. I heard them crying and I came in. I should not have. I understand that. I am sorry if I have caused any problem. Something moved behind those silver eyes. It was quick, and she could not name it. You are the Omega who cleans the North Corridor, he said. Yes, Your Majesty. You have no wolf, he said. It was not a question. Her file, apparently, was known to him. That is what I have been told, she said carefully. Can you stay with them tonight? He said. And the question so surprised her that she did not answer immediately, which was apparently an unusual experience for him because something shifted in his expression. I am asking if you are willing, he said, with the particular effort of someone who did not often need to clarify that they were asking, rather than commanding. Yes, Sarah said. Yes, Your Majesty. Of course. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair between the two cradles, and she watched the twins breathe in the amber light. And she thought about how strange it was that the first place she had felt something like peace in 4 years was in the nursery of the most powerful wolf in the known territories, watching over children who were not hers, and never could be. She did not reach for them again. She simply sat. And whatever warmth or frequency or impossible comfort she carried in her body, she let it exist in the room, and the twins slept through the night, for the first time since their crisis had begun. When the morning came and healer Voss found her still in the chair, the older woman's expression had shifted into something that Sarah could not quite categorize. The king wants to see you at mid-morning, Voss said. Before that, I want to examine you. Examine me, Sarah repeated. As a medical matter, Voss said. I want to understand what happened last night. The examination was thorough and strange, and not entirely comfortable, the kind of inspection that Sarah associated with the early days after her rejection, when various healers from various packs had tried to determine what was wrong with her, why she had no wolf, why she smelled different, why she occupied the margins of the supernatural world without quite belonging to it. Voss did not say what was wrong. She said very little. During the examination, which was itself unusual enough to be alarming, she pressed her fingers against the space below Sarah's shoulder blades and was quiet for a very long time. She held Sarah's wrists and closed her eyes. She asked Sarah to breathe deeply and hold it and release, and listen to something that Sarah could not hear. When it was over, Voss sat back and folded her hands and looked at Sarah with an expression that had passed through alarm and come out the other side into something much more serious. I need to run a blood work analysis, Voss said. It will take several days. What are you looking for? Sarah asked. I am not entirely sure yet, Voss said, but I think I may be wrong about what you are. Kalen received her in his private study, which was a room that managed to be both grand and austerely functional, full of maps and ledgers, and the detritus of a man who governed an enormous territory with relentless personal involvement. He was standing at the window when she was shown in, his back to her, and he did not turn immediately, which she suspected was either deliberate or simply the natural behavior of someone who had never needed to demonstrate urgency for anyone. How did they sleep? He said without turning. Through the night, she said, without waking. She heard something change in his breathing, very slight, a shift in rhythm that in a less controlled man would have been a long exhale. Sit down, he said, and turned from the window and crossed to his desk, and Sarah sat in the chair across from it. He sat across from her and studied her in the morning light. And she let herself be studied because there was nothing else to do. "I am going to make an adjustment to your position here," he said. "I want you reassigned to the nursery, primary attendance. You will have a proper room in the staff quarters adjacent to the north wing, an appropriate wage increase, and full access to the nursery at any hour." Sarah opened her mouth and closed it. "I understand this is irregular," he said, watching her. "Given your rank." "I do not have a rank," she said. "You have a position in this palace," he said. "And I am elevating it. Do you have an objection?" "No," she said. "Good," he said, and looked down at the ledger on his desk, which was apparently the end of the conversation. Except that it was not, quite, because he looked up once more and said, "What is your name?" "Sarah," she said. He nodded. He looked back at his ledger. She left. Isolde Vanthorpe arrived at Ashenvale 3 days later for what the official correspondence described as a diplomatic visit regarding the trade agreement between the Vanthorpe territory and the Northern Reaches. Everyone in the palace who had been there more than a month understood that this was not primarily about trade. Lady Isolde had been in quiet discussion with the King's Council for the better part of a year, and the nature of those discussions was the particular kind that involved terms. Like political alliance and future stability, and the comfort of having a structured arrangement in the event of ongoing uncertainty. She was, in the language that court people used when they wanted to say something without saying it, a candidate. She was stunning in the way that certain women are stunning when they have devoted considerable intelligence and resource to the project of appearing effortlessly beautiful. Her hair was the precise dark red of certain autumn leaves, worn in an E. Elaborate arrangement that somehow never looked labored, and her eyes were the amber gold of high-ranking lichen females, sharp and evaluating beneath their practiced warmth. She moved through the palace with the confidence of someone who had already calculated her odds and found them favorable, stopping to speak with council members, complimenting the head of household, asking questions about the heirs with an expression of careful, measured concern that was so well performed, it was nearly indistinguishable from genuine feeling. She found out about Sarah on the second day. Sarah was not aware of being found out. She was in the nursery, where she spent most of her hours now, learning the particular rhythms and preferences of two small people who communicated in the wordless, absolute language of very young children, and who had decided, with the uncompromising certainty of infants, that Sarah was a safe thing to be near. Aldrich was quieter than his brother, more watchful, with his father's silver eyes already fully present in a way that was slightly unnerving in a child who could not yet speak. Soren was louder, more physical, given to grabbing with his whole small fist anything that came within reach. They were, in the assessment of everyone who worked with them, extraordinary children, and they had chosen Sarah with a completeness that no one had yet been able to explain, and several people had begun to find troubling. She did not know about any of this. She was singing. Very quietly. Not a song she had learned anywhere, but something that simply existed in her. Some melody that seemed to come from the same place as the warmth in her hands. And Aldrich was watching her with those disconcerting silver eyes, while Soren made a determined attempt to pull her braid through the slats of his cradle, when the nursery door opened, and Lady Isolde stepped inside. The change in the room was immediate. Both twins registered it, the way that young animals register a shift in air quality before they can name why. Aldrich's expression went from watchful to closed. Soren released Sarah's braid. Isolde looked at Sarah with an expression that was perfectly, expertly pleasant, and said, "You must be the girl everyone is talking about." Sarah stood and dipped her head in the appropriate acknowledgement of a person of higher rank. "I am Sarah, my lady. I attend the heirs." "Attend," Isolde repeated, letting the word sit there with its implications while she looked around the intim room. She was wearing a gown the color of forest moss, deeply elegant, and she smelled of something expensive and floral that Sarah's senses registered as fundamentally wrong, though she could not have said why. "I have heard the story, of course. The Omega Maid who silenced the royal heirs. Quite a feat." "I do not fully understand it myself, my lady," Sarah said. "No," Isolde said pleasantly. "I imagine not." She looked at the twins with an expression that was meant to convey warmth and achieved something that was a precise simulation of it. Aldrich stared back at her with the blank, unblinking gaze of a child who has not yet learned to pretend. Soren began to cry. It was a quiet cry, not the desperate screaming of before, but steady and certain, the cry of a child who has decided something is not right. Isolde's pleasant expression did not waver, but something moved behind her eyes. "Well," she said, "I can see you are busy." She left. Sarah looked down at Soren, who was still crying. Softly, "It is all right," she said quietly, putting her finger against his small fist, which he grabbed with immediate conviction. "She is gone." He stopped. Aldrich watched the door where Isolde had been standing with those silver eyes for a moment longer, and then looked at Sarah. And there was something in that look that Sarah had no language for. Something that felt like communication without words, like something very old being recognized by something equally old. She shook herself. She was an Omega without a wolf, alone in the world, doing a job that was more than she had been given reason to expect. She was not going to start imagining that infants were sending her messages. She went back to her work. The council meeting that Sarah did not know she was discussed in took place that evening. Healer Voss presented the preliminary findings of her blood work analysis with the particular careful tone of someone presenting information they know will be contested. The sample shows several anomalous markers, Voss said. Specifically, certain proteins that are typically associated with lichen bloodlines of a very specific heritage. Heritage that I would not have expected to find in an unranked Omega. "What heritage?" said Councillor Dre, who was the king's head of intelligence, and who asked all questions with the same tone he might use to press on a bruise. "I want to run additional tests before I make a definitive statement," Voss said. "But the preliminary pattern is consistent with Sylveth lineage." The silence in the room after that was different from an ordinary silence. It was the silence of people recalibrating. At the head of the table, Kalen said nothing. He was looking at the window again, his expression exactly as controlled as it always was, and only Voss, who had known him since before he was king, could have identified the slight shift in the angle of his jaw that indicated he was processing something significant. Sylveth. The name carried weight in the history of the lichen world, the way that certain words carry weight, not just as information, but as a kind of gravity. The Sylveth bloodline had been the last true counterpart to the Ashenvale line. The two great dynasties of the ancient territories, bound by old law and older magic, before the wars and the collapse and the 3 generations of silence that had followed. The Sylveth were believed extinct. Every record indicated this. There had been a child, it was said, an infant girl who had disappeared in the chaos of the final conflict, but no one had found her. And after enough decades of absence becomes its own form of proof. If she carries Sylveth blood, Councillor Dre said carefully, then the implications for her status in this court would be significant. "That is an understatement," said another councillor. "If she is Sylveth, she does not merely have a status. She has a claim." More silence. "Run the tests again," the king said. It was the first thing he had said. "In 15 minutes. And say nothing to her until the results are confirmed." Sarah, unaware that her blood was being debated in a council chamber, was having the first pleasant evening she had experienced in several years. She had been given a room that was not large, but was warm, with a window that looked out over the palace gardens, and a bed that was not a pallet on a shared dormitory floor. She sat on the edge of this bed after her shift, and looked at the window and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a luxury. And then she thought about the twins, and felt the particular warmth in her chest that she was beginning to accept as simply a fact about herself, something she carried the way some people carry a memory or a song. She thought about the way Aldrich watched her, that disconcerting ancient gaze. She thought about Soren's immediate and total trust, the way he grabbed with his whole being. She thought about what it meant to be needed, to be the specific shape of comfort that someone required, and she pushed the thought away before it could become something more painful, because she was very practiced at pushing away the thoughts that would hurt her if she let them develop. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. She did not push away quickly enough, because what she found herself thinking about, in the quiet of her first real room in years, was the king. Not in any way she could have defended or explained. Not with any expectation or plan. Simply the fact of him, standing at the window of his study with his back to her. The slight change in his breathing when she told him the twins had slept through the night. The way he had asked her name at the end, as an afterthought that was somehow not an afterthought. She pressed her hands together in her lap and reminded herself clearly and firmly that she was an omega without a wolf, recently elevated from floor scrubbing to nursery attendance, and that whatever she was imagining was so far outside the boundaries of plausibility that it did not merit the energy of even entertaining it. She went to sleep. She dreamed of Silver. Lady Isolde's next move came precisely 3 days later, and it was elegant, as all of Isolde's moves were elegant, because she had been planning her ascent to this position for long enough that she had learned to make necessity look like generosity. She requested a private meeting with Marta, the head attendant, and expressed with great warmth and careful concern that she had noticed the unusual arrangement in the nursery and wanted to make sure that the king's children were being given every possible advantage. She had, she said, brought with her from the Vanthorpe estate a highly experienced nursery specialist, a ranked female lichen with a documented history of working with royal children, and she thought it might be beneficial, purely for the heirs' well-being, to integrate this specialist into the current arrangement. Marta, who was loyal to the palace but also very aware of political weather, agreed that this seemed entirely reasonable and said she would arrange it. Isolde smiled and said she was grateful, and that of course this was only about the children. The specialist was introduced to the nursery the following morning, and her name was Delia, and she was everything Isolde had described, competent and warm and experienced, and she looked at Sarah with an expression of professional assessment that contained underneath it, barely visible but present, the specific contempt of a high-ranked wolf for something that did not register as a proper wolf at all. Sarah recognized it. She had been recognizing that expression her entire life. She did not react to it. She had also learned that. "I am told you have a remarkable connection with the heirs," Delia said pleasantly. "It seems to be the case," Sarah said. "I have been working with royal children for 15 years, Delia said. "In 3 different courts." "I imagine you have a great deal to offer," Sarah said, and kept her voice neutral, and went back to Soren, who was making his feelings about the new arrival very clear through the medium of sustained and pointed crying. It was Healer Voss who went to the king. She did not frame it as a conflict or a complaint, because she had not survived 30 years of palace medicine by being clumsy about things that required delicacy. She simply mentioned, in the context of the ongoing analysis of Sarah's blood work, that there had been a change to the nursery staffing, and that she thought the king should be aware of it, given the particular situation with the heirs. Kaelin listened. He said nothing for a moment. "Who authorized this?" he said. "Lady Isolde brought the suggestion to Marta," Voss said. "Marta approved it." Another silence. "I see," he said. It was 2 words, and it contained within it a judgment and a decision, and a correction in progress, and Voss recognized all of this, and withdrew very carefully. Kaelin came to the nursery that afternoon for the first time in 3 days. He arrived without announcement, which was not unusual for him, and the room rearranged itself around his presence the way rooms always did, nurses straightening, Delia turning with a professionally warm smile, Marta appearing from somewhere. Sarah was in the far corner of the room with Aldrich against her shoulder, the child having decided that this particular afternoon required absolute proximity to Sarah, and was not interested in any alternative arrangements. And she looked up when the king entered, and then looked down again, because looking at the king was not something she did, if she could avoid it. She heard him cross the room. She heard the brief exchange with Delia, quiet and polite, and utterly without warmth. She heard Marta explain the new arrangement with the particular verbal delicacy of someone trying to describe a decision they are beginning to suspect was a mistake. And then the footsteps continued across the room until they stopped very close to her, and she looked up. "How are they?" he said. His eyes went to Aldrich first, who had turned his head to look at his father with that silver gaze, and then something softened, almost imperceptibly, in the king's expression. Something that was there for only a moment before the discipline of years closed back over it. "He wanted to be held," Sarah said quietly. "He has been out of sorts this morning." The king reached out and touched his son's head very gently, a brief, careful touch. The touch of a man who was terrified of wanting too much and had learned to express love in very small quantities because he could not afford to lose it. Aldrich leaned slightly toward his father's hand, in the same instinctive way he leaned toward Sarah's warmth. The king let out a breath. "Delia," he said, without raising his voice. Delia appeared at his shoulder. "Thank you for your service. You are dismissed from the nursery. Your wages for the full week will be paid." The professionalism in Delia's expression flickered, just slightly. "Of course, Your Majesty." She left. Sarah did not look at the king. She looked at Aldrich. She could feel Kaelin's gaze on the side of her face, the way you feel the presence of something very warm standing nearby in cold air. "I want the arrangements here to remain as they were," he said, apparently to the room at large. "Nothing changes. Without my direct authorization. Is that understood?" It was understood. Isolde found Sarah alone in the palace library that evening, which was not an accident. Sarah had gone there to find one of the children's books that Voss had mentioned as particularly good for reading aloud to infants, and she was running her finger along the spines of the relevant shelf when she heard the door close behind her with the particular soft click of someone who has planned the closing. She turned. Isolde was wearing deep wine red and looking at Sarah with an expression that had dropped its performance now that they were alone, and what was underneath was considerably colder. "You are clever," Isolde said. "I would not have thought so, looking at you. But the way you have positioned yourself is actually rather impressive for someone of your background." Sarah set down the book she had been holding. "I have not positioned myself anywhere, my lady," she said. "I was assigned to the nursery because the Heirs responded to my presence. That is the whole of it." "You actually believe that?" Isolde said, with a slight tilt of her head that expressed precisely calibrated disbelief. "There is something happening here that you are a part of, whether you understand it or not. And I want you to understand something very clearly. I have spent years building toward this. My family has invested considerably. The council supports this arrangement. The king needs a political alliance and a queen and an official structure for his heir's succession, and I am the logical and correct choice for all of those things." She paused. "You are a cleaning girl without a wolf. Whatever temporary curiosity you have inspired will pass. I suggest you use this period of elevated status wisely and save enough to make your future comfortable, because you will not be in this palace much longer." Sarah looked at her for a moment. There was something moving through her that she identified carefully, making sure she knew what it was before she let it inform how she spoke. It was not fear. It was something older than fear. Something that her body recognized even when her mind did not have language for it. Something that felt, in the strangest way, like finally being named. "Thank you for being direct with me, my lady," Sarah said. "I prefer directness to strategy. It is easier to know what you are actually dealing with." She picked up her book. "Good evening." She walked out of the library and she kept her spine straight until she was well out of sight, and then she leaned against the wall in an empty corridor and pressed her hand to her chest and felt her heart doing something entirely unreasonable. And after a moment, she realized she was not afraid. She was angry. It was the first time in 4 years she had felt truly angry, and it moved through her like light through water, and she did not know what to do with it yet. But she recognized it as hers. The results of the blood work came back 12 days after Voss first took the sample. Voss came to Sarah's room to tell her, which was itself significant. a healer coming to an attendant, rather than summoning her. Sarah was sitting at her small desk writing notes about the twins' feeding schedule, because she had found that organized information helped her do her job better, and no one had told her she could not do it. And she looked up when Voss knocked and entered, with an expression that Sarah had never seen on her face before. It was the expression of someone who has confirmed something they suspected, and is still not entirely sure how to present it. "Sit down," Voss said, and Sarah was already sitting, which seemed to briefly derail Voss. And then the healer sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap. "I need to tell you something about your blood work results," she said. "And I need you to understand that what I am about to say changes nothing about who you are as a person. It simply clarifies what you are in a more structural sense." Sarah set down her pen. "All right," she said. "Your blood carries the Sylveth markers," Voss said. "Definitively, the additional tests confirm the initial finding. You are not merely carrying trace ancestry. The concentration is primary lineage. Sarah." She paused. "You are Sylveth." The name meant nothing to Sarah in the way that names mean things to people who have grown up inside a history. She knew the word, the way you know the names of ancient things, abstractly, without personal attachment. But she watched Voss's face, and she read the weight on it, and she understood that the name meant something enormous, even if she could not yet map the shape of that something. "The Sylveth line was believed extinct," she said slowly. "Yes," Voss said. "The last heir was an infant who disappeared in the final conflict, 3 generations ago. Everyone believed that she had not survived. But apparently what actually happened is that she was taken and hidden, and that she survived, and that she had descendants." Sarah felt very still in the way that you feel still before something very large has finished arriving. "I was abandoned," she said. "My birth pack said I was left on their territory as a newborn. They never knew where I came from." "No," Voss said gently. "I imagine they did not." The silence in the room was the kind that does not feel empty. It felt full of things that were arranging themselves into new configurations. "What does this mean?" Sarah said, and she heard her own voice as something very steady, much steadier than she would have expected. "It means," Voss said carefully, "that your position in the world is considerably different from what you were told it was. Sylveth does not carry a lower rank than Ashenvale. It is a parallel dynasty, an equal one. And there are old laws," she paused, "very old laws, that were written in the time when both lines existed, about what was supposed to happen if both lines continued." Sarah stared at her. "Say it directly," she said. "The old law specifies," Voss said, "that should both bloodlines persist, the matter of the mate bond between them is not optional. It is not political. It is written into the blood of both lines, the Sylveth heir and the Ashenvale king." She stopped. She did not need to say the rest. Kaelin received the report in his study in the evening, alone, because he had asked Voss to give it to him without counsel present. He read it twice. He set it on the desk and stood at the window, which was apparently where he went when the world required processing that he could not do while sitting. He stood there for a long time. He thought about a morning 3 weeks ago when he had walked into the nursery and found his son sleeping soundly for the first time in days, and the Omega attendant sitting in the chair between the cradles with the particular stillness of someone who has been awake all night and has decided it was worth it. He thought about the way she had said, "I do not fully understand it myself," with a simplicity that had nothing to perform in it. He thought about what it had felt like to stand near her while she held Aldrich, that specific quality of warmth and steadiness that he had recognized on some level beneath reason, and had been very carefully not examining since. He thought about his queen, who was gone, and about the months of silence that had followed, and about the twins who had needed something he could not provide, and had found it in the most impossible person imaginable. He thought about old law and old blood, and things that had been true for centuries without anyone being there to acknowledge them. He sat down. He picked up the report. He read it a third time. He said to the empty room, Of course. She thought about the walk back to her room from the library, the anger moving through her like light through water, and how strange it had been to feel something so clear and so unambiguous. After years of feeling primarily the muted gray of simple endurance. Isolde was wrong, but not in the way that most wrong people are wrong, out of stupidity or ignorance. She was wrong in the specific way of someone who has built a very careful understanding of the world that does not include room for the things that do not fit her categories. An omega without a wolf did not fit any of Isolde's categories for threat, and so Isolde had looked at Sarah and seen something she could dismiss, and the looking had been honest enough, just incomplete. Sarah understood this. Understanding it did not make it less painful, but it made it more manageable, and management of pain was something she was genuinely skilled at. She thought about Elder Brannock, and about the circle of judgment, and about the word released and how she had carried it for 4 years as a definition of herself, a border that told her where she ended. Released, set free, expelled, all the same word wearing different faces. And here she was in a palace of cold stone and high ceilings, and portraits of silver-eyed warriors, and 2 small boys had looked at her, and known something that Elder Brannock had missed entirely, and she did not yet know what that meant in the largest sense. But she knew what it felt like, which was a beginning. Kalen, in his own study that same evening, was doing the particular thing he did when he needed to process something that did not fit neatly into any existing framework. He was reading. Not the ledgers or the political correspondence or the strategic assessments that normally occupied his evenings, but one of the old records, the historical texts that predated the current court by several centuries, the ones that documented the twin dynasties in the language of people who had assumed both would continue. He read about the Sylvith line with the careful attention he brought to all things, noting what the record said about their particular gifts, the warmth, the ability to calm, the connection to young life, the gold light that the old writers described in terms that were somewhere between medical observation and religious awe. He read about the old law. He read it twice, as he had read Voss's report twice, because he did not like to act on a single reading of anything important. The law was unambiguous in the way that laws written by people who did not anticipate needing to be argued with often are. Both lines present, the bond activates. Not should activate, not may. Activate. Activates. Present tense. Eternal present. The grammar of inevitability. He set the book down. He thought about a woman sitting in a chair between 2 cradles all night, staying awake out of no obligation and every instinct. He thought about the warmth in the nursery when she was in it, and the particular quality of his son's sleep since she had come. He was not a man who dealt in sentiment, but he was a man who dealt in evidence, and the evidence was very clear. In the lichen world, performed once a year at the first full moon of spring, in which the children of royal bloodlines were presented to the pack's ancient ancestors through a ceremony of moonlight and blood recognition. For the twins, this would be their first acknowledging, which meant that for the first time, their blood would be formally offered to whatever watching intelligence the old rituals believed would receive it. The court had been preparing for weeks. Isolde had positioned herself carefully for this event, arriving in the ceremonial hall early, placing herself where the council would see her, ensuring that her participation in the evening read as appropriate and inevitable. She had spoken with 3 council members that day about the importance of formal structure and stable succession, and all 3 had agreed with her, because she was very good at making people agree with her. The hall was full of the court's most powerful figures, all in ceremonial attire, the ancient silver lights, casting everything in the particular luminescence that moonlit ceremonies required. Sarah had been told that her attendance at the acknowledging was required as the primary heir's attendant. She wore the formal uniform of palace attendants, which was a better cut than her cleaning clothes, but still marked her clearly as staff rather than nobility, and she stood with Voss near the attendants section, and held Soren while a nurse held Aldrich, and waited for the ceremony to begin. The ancient healer, who performed the ritual, a very old wolf named Corthan, who seemed to have survived by transforming himself gradually into something almost beyond the ordinary physical, moved through the opening invocations with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that certain things should not be rushed. The hall was quiet in the way that ceremonial spaces are quiet, a communal silence that has a texture to it. And then the moment of blood recognition came, in which the heir's blood was touched too. The ancient stone of lineage that sat at the center of the ritual circle, and Corthan bent over the stone, and the stone lit. It did not light in the soft, ceremonial silver that it was supposed to produce for royal Ashenvale blood. It lit in two colors, silver for the Ashenvale line, bright and familiar, and something else, something that had not been seen in the stone in 3 generations, a deep gold light that moved through the silver the way the sun moves through water, not competing with it but completing it. Every person in the hall who was old enough to know their history went very still. Corthan straightened from the stone and turned, not toward the council, not toward Lady Isolde, but toward the attendance section, with eyes that were looking for something specific, and found it immediately. "There is Sylveth blood here," he said, and his voice carried through the silence with the perfect, unforced projection of someone who had been making pronouncements in large halls for 60 years. Present in the children, which means present in whoever carries the Sylveth bond to them. Every head in the hall turned. Isolde's expression did not change. It could not afford to change. But behind her eyes, something moved with considerable velocity. Corthan's gaze settled on Sarah, who was standing very still with Soren against her shoulder, and the realization of what was happening moving through her with the slow, devastating clarity of something she had been approaching for weeks without knowing it. "You," Corthan said. "Come here, child." The walk from the attendance section to the ritual circle was the longest walk Sarah had ever taken. She was aware of every eye in the hall following her, aware of Isolde's stillness in her peripheral vision, aware of the weight of Soren in her arms and the anchoring quality of it, the fact of him, warm and real and certain. She stepped into the ritual circle. Corthan took her free hand and pressed her palm to the stone, and the gold light flared so brightly that several people in the front rows instinctively stepped back, and then the silver rose to meet it, and the 2 lights wound together in the stone, with the coherence of something that had been waiting to do exactly this for a very long time. "Sylveth," Corthan said, not as a question, not as a revelation to her, as a confirmation to the hall. The line persists. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in the specific tumult of people who have received information that restructures everything they thought they understood, all talking at once, the council members turning to each other, the noble families recalibrating, Isolde standing in the middle of it with her face completely controlled and her hands loose at her sides, which was the only sign of what it was costing her. Sarah stood in the ritual circle with the gold light fading against her palm and looked for exactly one person in the room. Kaelin was standing at the edge of the ritual circle, and he was already looking at her. He had not moved when the stone lit. He had not turned to the council, or looked at Isolde, or conferred with anyone. He was looking at Sarah with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, something that was not the controlled silver neutrality of the king, something older and more unguarded, something that his eyes were doing without his permission. She saw it, that thing in his eyes, and she felt, answering it from somewhere in her own chest, the mate. Bond complete itself in the space between them like a lock, finding a key, like 2 notes finding the chord they were always meant to form together. It was quiet and total and as inevitable as anything she had ever experienced. He crossed the circle. He stopped in front of her. "Sarah," he said, and her name in his mouth was different than it had been in his study 3 weeks ago, when it had been almost an afterthought. Now it was something else entirely. "I know," she said quietly. He looked at her for another moment, and then he looked at Soren, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the perfect trust of a child who has found what he needed, and the expression on the king's face when he looked at his son being held by this impossible woman was the most human expression Sarah had ever seen on him. "There are protocols," he said, For this situation. Very old ones. I imagine there are, she said. They will be contested, he said. Isolde's family will contest it. The council will debate it. It will be complicated and probably unpleasant for a while. I understand that, she said. I have spent 4 years being an Omega without a wolf, doing work that people with my apparent rank do, and surviving. I can manage complicated and unpleasant. Something in his expression shifted toward something that in another man would have been a smile, not quite reaching one, but adjacent to it. I believe you, he said. Good, she said. He reached out and very carefully, with the same deliberateness he had used to touch his son's head in the nursery, he touched her face. His fingers were warm against her cheek, and the bond between them sang in her blood, her Sylveth blood, her real blood, the blood that had been waiting for this since she was born. We will figure out the protocols, he said. Together. Together, she agreed. Soren slept on, unbothered. She did not know what to do with the things she was feeling, which was itself new, because for 4 years she had been very precise about the management of her inner life. You did not let yourself want things you could not have. You did not let yourself love things that would be taken. You kept yourself small and useful and grateful for the small usefulness, and you did not look at windows and think about what might be on the other side of them. She had been so practiced at this containment that it had stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling like simply who she was, a person, without the full range of ordinary wanting, someone whose desires had been trimmed back to practicalities. And now the full range was returning, awkwardly and all at once, the way feeling returns to a cold limb, not painlessly, full of strange sensation and the uncomfortable awareness of what had been missing. She sat in her good room that night, the room she had been given for her nursery work, and she thought about gold light in ancient stone, and she thought about silver eyes, and she thought about what Voss had said, very old laws, written into the blood of both lines, and she pressed her hands together and felt the warmth that had always been in them, the warmth she had spent years not understanding, and for the first time, it occurred to her that the warmth had always been trying to tell her something, and that the language it spoke in was older than any language she had words for. What followed was exactly as complicated as Kaelin had predicted, and not quite as unpleasant as Sarah had feared, partly because the old laws were extraordinarily clear on the subject of Sylveth and Ashenvale, and partly because Corthin, who had survived 60 years of Lycan court politics, was an unexpectedly formidable advocate for the literal text of ancient law, and was not impressed by Isolde's family's objections, or by the council's careful suggestions that perhaps a modern interpretation might be appropriate. The blood work was presented formally. The stone's testimony, as Corthin called it, was entered into the official record. Isolde sat through 3 days of formal proceedings with an expression of perfect composure and did not contest anything in a way that could be directly challenged, because she was, above all else, strategic, and she understood very clearly that the field had changed and that the dignified exit was the only option that preserved anything for her future. She left Ashenvale on the 4th day with her retinue, and the last thing Sarah saw of her was the precise, elegant line of her back as she walked out of the palace gate, and Sarah did not feel triumph about it, only the particular exhaustion of watching a conflict end. The court adapted, because courts always adapt. It was not immediate, and it was not without difficulty, and there were approximately 11 separate formal complaints submitted by various noble families who had opinions about the appropriate rank and status of a former palace attendant. But the old laws were old enough and specific enough that the complaints did not ultimately alter the outcome. Voss supervised the formal investigation of Sarah's lineage, and the bloodline confirmation was complete and unambiguous. The training for what Sarah now needed to understand about her position and her heritage, and the political structure she was suddenly embedded in, began with Corthin, who proved to be a surprisingly patient teacher, and who seemed genuinely pleased that the Sylveth line had survived, as though the Continuation of an ancient bloodline was personally satisfying to him in a way that court politics and succession complications were not. Sarah spent mornings in the nursery, because that was not negotiable for her, and no one tried to make it negotiable, and afternoons in lessons, and evenings in the strange, quiet process of getting to know the man she was bonded to by blood and choice, and something older than either. They did not rush it. That was perhaps the thing that surprised her most. That, after the revelation and the ceremony and the formal processes, what followed was simply time. Kaelin did not transform overnight. He did not suddenly become warm where he had been cold, open where he had been closed. He was still the man he had made himself into after losing Mirabelle, careful and controlled and carrying a weight that had changed the shape of him. But he made space. He asked questions and listened to the answers with the particular quality of attention that she was learning was. How he expressed respect. He told her things about the twins, small things, observations that he had been making alone, and now had someone to say them to. He told her once, on an evening when they were walking in the palace gardens after the twins were asleep, that he had not expected this. That he had told himself, after Mirabelle, that whatever the mate bond laws required, he would manage structurally and politically, without allowing it to mean anything more than structure and politics. He told her this, with the directness of a man who believed in being honest, even when honesty was uncomfortable for him. She listened, and did not fill the silence that followed it, and after a moment he said, "I was wrong about that." She said, "I know." He said, "You were remarkably calm about all of this." She said, "I have spent 4 years with nothing. Having something is not a thing I can afford to be careless with." He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him, and whatever was in her face. When she said that, he reached for her hand and held it without saying anything, and they stood like that in the garden for a while, and it was enough. The claiming ceremony was held on the last full moon before summer, which was according to custom and also apparently the preference of Corthan, who had very specific views about which astronomical conditions were appropriate for various rituals. The court assembled for it, which was also custom, the formal public acknowledgement of a bond that had already been established in every way that mattered, but required the additional structure of witnesses and law, and the ancient words that made things official in the way that lichened society required things to be official. Sarah stood in the ritual circle again, in different clothing this time, not the uniform of an attendant or the simple wool of an omega, but something that Voss had overseen with the focused competence of a woman who had decided that this particular task deserved her personal attention. It was deep gold, the gold of the light in the stone, and in it Sarah looked like what she was, rather than what she had been told she was, which was perhaps the whole point. Aldrich and Soren were held by nurses at the edge of the circle, too young to understand the ceremony but present, because their father had specified they would be, and because Sarah had not said this aloud, but had thought it very clearly, and Kaelin had apparently understood. They were part of this too. They were the reason the story had taken the shape it took. Kaelin stood across from her in the circle, and looked at her with the silver eyes that had unnerved her when she first encountered them, and no longer did, because she knew now what he did with them when he was not being observed, the way they softened on his sons, the way they found her across rooms with a directness that he had stopped trying to moderate. He spoke the old words of claiming with the voice that was always quiet and never needed to be anything else. And when it was her turn, she spoke them back with the clarity of someone who had spent 4 years without a voice and was not going to waste this one. The stone lit when the words were complete. Both colors, silver and gold, wound together. And Corthan said something in the ancient tongue that none of the younger wolves in the room could translate, but that seemed to satisfy him enormously, and the hall witnessed it. All of the faces that had once looked at Sarah with contempt or dismissal or the specific nullity of not looking at her at all, and she let herself be seen by all of them, fully and without apology. Afterward, in the brief moment before the formal reception began when they were still technically in the ritual circle, and the rest of the court was still reorganizing itself, Kaelin leaned close to her and said, very quietly, into the space beside her ear, "How do you feel?" She thought about it. She thought about a dormitory floor and a mop and a corridor that smelled of cold stone, and the look on Elder Brannock's face when he said "you are released," as though she were an exhaled breath. She thought about the twins crying in the night and the warmth in her hands that she had not been able to explain. She thought about gold light in an ancient stone, and a king who learned to ask instead of command, and two small boys with silver eyes who had looked at her and recognized something no one else had been able to name. "Like I was always going to be here," she said. He straightened. He was almost but not quite smiling, that adjacency that she had learned to read as the real thing. "Yes," he said. "I think that is exactly right." The reception was long, and the court was complicated, and several noble families were still working through the implications of everything in real time and had opinions about it, and Isolde's absence was noted and discussed and eventually filed away by the court machinery that processed these things, and Sarah navigated all of it with the steadiness that 4 years of invisibility had given her, because it turned out that spending that much time learning not to react to things was actually a very useful preparation for a court environment. She stood beside the king at the formal dinner and accepted the acknowledgments of council members and noble representatives and senior pack officials with the same calm she brought to everything. And at some point during the evening, Kaylin's hand found the small of her back with the particular pressure of someone who is making a choice about public posture and has decided on proximity, and she was aware of it every moment for the rest of the evening, in the way you are aware of warmth when you have been cold for a very long time. Later, when the twins had been settled for the night and the palace had moved into the quieter rhythms of the late hours, and she was sitting in the chair between the cradles in the amber light of the nursery, because this was still where she came when she needed to think. She heard the door open and did not have to look to know who it was. Kaylin sat in the chair that had been placed beside hers, which was new, which someone on the staff had apparently decided to add in anticipation of this becoming a regular arrangement, and they sat together in the quiet while the twins slept, and it was not awkward or ceremonial or weighted with any of the complicated things that had preceded it. It was simply two people who had found each other, by the most improbable route imaginable, sitting in the room where the story had begun, with the proof of why it mattered sleeping in front of them. "Aldrich will walk before Soren," Kaylin said eventually. "I think so too," Sarah said. "Soren will talk first," he said. "Without question," she agreed. They were quiet again. "Thank you," he said. She turned to look at him. "For what?" she said. He looked at the twins. He looked at her. He had the expression that she was learning was what happened to his face when he let himself mean something without controlling it first. "For coming through that door," he said. She remembered standing outside the nursery, bucket and mop, the crying that bypassed her ears and went somewhere older. She remembered the moment her feet moved before her mind gave permission. She had thought at the time that she was making a mistake. She understood now that she had been making the truest choice of her life, even without knowing it, even when she was nothing, even when the world had agreed that she was nothing. Something in her had known where she was supposed to be. "I think that door was always there," she said, waiting for me to be ready to open it. He reached for her hand. The twins slept. The amber light held all of them in its warmth, the king and the queen who had been a maid, and the two small heirs who had known from the beginning what the rest of the world was still catching up to. And in the palace of Ashenvale, in the room where impossible things had begun, something that had been missing for a very long time was simply, quietly, finally complete. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?